October 14th, 1944, Bellwood, Texas. This photograph was taken by Army photographer Samuel Whitaker, a man who later said he didn't fully understand what he captured that morning. In the faded frame, a young German prisoner sits at a church organ, tears cutting down the dirt on his face. Behind him, an elderly American woman rests a trembling hand on his shoulder as though comforting her own son. The sunlight through the stained glass seems to freeze the moment in something almost sacred. But who was he? Why was a German POW allowed to sit at an American church organ, much less play it, and where were they taking him after this moment was captured? Witnesses remembered only one thing with certainty. Something broke inside this young soldier that morning, and something changed inside everyone who heard him play. October 14th, 1944, Bellwood Baptist Church, rural Texas. The morning sun had only begun to warm the red dirt fields when a lone figure stepped out of the back of a military truck parked beside the church. His hands were bound loosely in front of him, but what caught everyone's attention wasn't the rope. It was the small wooden toolbox he carried as he climbed the steps of the church, slowly, carefully, like a man approaching an altar he had no right to touch. Inside the sanctuary, a dozen American veterans sat in the first 3 pews, broad-shouldered men in denim jackets and Sunday hats, men who had fought in North Africa, in Sicily, in the Solomons. Their eyes snapped toward the doorway as the POW entered, escorted by a single MP who looked as surprised as everyone else. Whispers moved through the church like a sudden gust of wind. "We're letting a Nazi touch the Lord's organ. That boy's crazy bringing him in here. I lost my nephew at Anzio, and now this." The German prisoner didn't look up. He was 26, thin from months of rationed food, his blonde hair trimmed short, his prison denim uniform faded by the Texas sun. His name was Lucas Weber, once an apprentice organ builder in Stuttgart, the kind of man who spent his life shaping wood, tuning pipes, and coaxing music from machinery older than his grandparents. But that belonged to another world. Now he was just the Kraut, a number on a roster, a body assigned to work details around Camp Hearn. Yet today, for reasons none of the churchgoers understood, he had been brought here. Bellwood Baptist was a small white-painted church seated at the edge of cotton fields, its steeple visible from the old highway that cut through the fields like a cracked bone. Inside stood the pride of the congregation, a 70-year-old pipe organ imported from New York in 1874. It had survived dust storms, hurricanes, and decades of humidity. But 2 months ago, it had fallen silent. The bellows wheezed like a dying man. A pipe rank had collapsed. The organist swore she heard something inside rattle like angry spirits. Nobody in Bellwood knew how to fix such a machine. Nobody, except apparently the German standing at the front of the sanctuary. The MP cleared his throat. "Pastor, this is him. He said he knows how to repair it." Pastor Whitlow, a lean man in his 60s with a voice honed by a lifetime of preaching, studied the prisoner. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in something closer to reluctant hope. He gestured to the organ. "Do you think you can make her sing again?" Lucas looked up for the first time. His English was limited, but he understood enough. "I try," he said softly, "but I need to open pipes. Touch inside. Is allowed?" It was such an innocent question that half the congregation stiffened. Allowed? A German prisoner reaching inside their church's beating heart. In October 1944, while American boys were bleeding in the Hurtgen forest, while the newspapers printed lists of sons who wouldn't be coming home? The irony was too much for some. A farmer named Roy Thompson stood abruptly. His oldest son was somewhere in France fighting through hedgerows filled with German fire. The sight of a POW standing by the pulpit made something inside him twist sharp and painful. "You're telling me a Nazi's going to fix our organ," he said, voice rising. "What's next? Inviting him to Sunday potluck?" Others muttered agreement. A few women shook their heads. One elderly widow clutched her Bible tighter. But the MP said nothing, and Pastor Whitlow didn't flinch. He simply replied, "The Lord uses unexpected instruments." Lucas stepped closer to the organ. The wooden case towered over him like a cathedral in miniature. The carved flourishes, the rows of pipes stretching toward the ceiling, the worn foot pedals. He touched the polished wood with 2 fingers as if greeting an old friend. His shoulders trembled, though no one could tell if it was from nerves or reverence. Behind him, the whispers grew sharper. "This is insane. Why are we trusting him? After what they did at Pearl Harbor, well, he didn't do that, but still." The contradiction of the moment, the enemy standing in an American sanctuary, trusted with an instrument they called sacred, hung heavy in the air. Because outside these church walls, the United States was the arsenal of democracy, producing more guns, planes, and ships than the rest of the world combined. American factories worked night and day. Teenage boys delivered scrap metal to war drives. Women welded steel in Detroit, and families prayed every night for sons fighting in Europe and the Pacific. Yet here, in this small Texas church, the same nation that commanded the might of the free world had opened its doors to a prisoner and handed him something priceless. Lucas placed his toolbox on the bench and knelt beside the ruined bellows. He removed a handful of metal screws, lined them carefully on a cloth, and lifted the side panel. A few children leaned forward in fascination. Their parents pulled them back. He inspected the mechanism with practiced precision, fingers moving the way they once had in his father's workshop. He could see the problem immediately: a cracked leather valve, warped from decades of heat and drought. He murmured something in German, not a curse but a craftsman's sigh. Pastor Whitlow stepped closer. "Can it be fixed?" Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but slow. Careful. Music takes time." The pastor's eyes softened. "Then take your time, son." A ripple of discomfort moved through the pews at that last word, "son." But Whitlow didn't retract it. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows, throwing red and gold patterns across Lucas's hands as he worked. Dust rose in tiny clouds with each movement. Tools clicked softly against metal. The sanctuary fell into an uneasy silence, the kind that made breaths sound too loud. Through it all, Lucas didn't look up. He didn't see the suspicion or the pride, or the wounded grief in the eyes watching him. He only saw the organ, an instrument whose language he understood in a country where every other word was foreign. For the first time since his capture, he felt like more than a prisoner. Outside, the wind rustled the Texas cotton. Newspapers miles away printed headlines of victory, sacrifice, and death. But inside Bellwood Baptist Church, something quieter, something older than war, was beginning to stir. No one in that room yet knew it, but this moment, this morning, this trembling beginning, would change all of them. And it started with the simple, shocking sight of a German POW repairing an American church organ. Lucas felt the weight of the sanctuary pressing down on him long before anyone spoke. It rose from the pews like heat from a forge, fear, sharpened by grief, shaped by months of war headlines. He recognized the posture of the men seated closest to him, elbows on knees, jaws set tight, hats pulled low, hands rough from farm labor or military service. Men who had seen too much death or whose families had tasted the bitterness of it. Men who watched him not as a craftsman, nor even as a prisoner, but as a representative of every loss carved into their hearts. He pretended to focus on the organ's inner workings, but he couldn't silence the echo of their whispers. What if he sabotages it? They burned churches in Europe, didn't they? Let him try something and see what happens. His English wasn't perfect, but fear needs little translation. He knew the tone, the tension. It lived in his ribs like a second heartbeat. He tightened his grip on a screwdriver, knuckles whitening. In Stuttgart, he'd worked on organs in churches older than the American colonies. He remembered lifting pipes with his father, rubbing oil into the wood grain, tuning each note until it rang true. Churches had been places of peace. Here, he felt like an intruder stepping on sacred soil, each breath a trespass. The MP standing behind him had given no instructions besides, "Fix it if you can." No reassurance, no promise of safety. Lucas knew enough of war to understand that mistakes, especially by prisoners, invited punishment. He swallowed hard, throat dry. What if he broke something? What if the organ failed to play? Would they accuse him of sabotage? Would he be dragged out the door and beaten? Strung up by the flagpole? Shot? Rumors in the camp spread fast, stories of prisoners punished for less. He focused on his hands. Slow. Careful. Don't anger them. But even as he tried to steady himself, the congregation's fear churned like a storm. Roy Thompson, the farmer who'd spoken earlier, leaned forward, voice thick with anger. "My boy died fighting them," he said, louder this time. "And you want one to fix our organ?" Everyone heard it. Even the birds outside paused their songs. Roy's son, John Thompson, had been killed at Monte Cassino 6 months earlier. His name was carved freshly into a marble plaque in the church hallway. The town had buried an empty coffin, because his body, like thousands of others, never came home. Lucas knew none of this, but he felt the man's hatred like heat on the back of his neck. He kept his eyes on the bellows, on the cracked leather, on anything but the faces staring at him like a threat. Pastor Whitlow sighed softly. "Roy," he said, not unkindly, "we asked for someone who knew how to repair it. The boy is, well, he's all we've got." Roy shook his head, lips trembling. "You don't fix a broken heart with the hands that caused it." The room went still. Another veteran, Mr. Caldwell, a barrel-chested man with a limp from North Africa, cleared his throat. "We don't know this German. Don't know what he believes. Don't know what he did." "He's one of them," someone muttered. "That's enough. Hitler doesn't send boys like him for nothing. Maybe he's here to spy." "Spy on what? The hymnal?" Another scoffed, but even humor couldn't cut the tension. Fear, raw, personal, ancient, filled every corner of the sanctuary. And beneath it, something heavier, grief that needed somewhere to go. Lucas felt it gathering like a storm behind him. He wished he could shrink himself smaller, crawl into the organ's wooden frame, disappear into the pipes. Instead, he kept working. Meanwhile, the American fear grew from something deeper than one German prisoner. It came from the war itself, a war that touched every family in Bellwood. Every home sent either a boy or a brother to the front lines. The local newspaper published casualty lists weekly. War bond posters hung in every shop window. Mothers listened to the radio with clenched hands as reports poured in. Normandy, Guam, Saipan, the Hurtgen Forest. Across the ocean, American soldiers were killing Germans, and Germans were killing Americans. Yet here stood one German inside a Texas church, touching things sacred to people who had sacrificed more than he could imagine. In the pews, Mrs. Parker held a telegram folded inside her Bible, a yellow slip informing her that her grandson was missing in action in France. The sight of Lucas tightening screws on the organ made her chest ache with a confusion she did not know how to name. "He's so young," she whispered to her daughter beside her. "Looks just like Tommy did." Her daughter shook her head quickly, trying not to feel sympathy, not wanting to feel anything resembling it. Fear twisted every thought. Across the sanctuary, a teenaged boy, barely 16, wore his father's old service cap. He stared at Lucas with a mixture of curiosity and anger. His father had told him stories of fighting Germans in Tunisia. Hard men, disciplined, relentless. The prisoner before him looked nothing like the enemy in those tales. And that contradiction alone frightened the boy more than he could describe. Fear does that. It thrives in contradictions. Even the MP wasn't immune. His hand rested lightly on his holster, eyes tracking Lucas's every motion. He didn't expect trouble, but he wasn't about to rule it out. Not after hearing what Germans had done in Europe. Not in 1944, when every newspaper printed the word Nazi like a curse. Outside the church walls, America was the strongest it had ever been. President Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy had turned factories into fortresses of industry. 96,000 aircraft produced that year alone. 8 million tons of ships launched from American shipyards. Farms overflowed with food for troops abroad and civilians at home. The entire country pulsed with purpose, unity, and sacrifice. And with that unity came a fierce protectiveness, a sense that anything threatening their boys overseas must be kept at arm's length. So seeing a German, even a tired, thin one, touch their church organ felt wrong, like letting the enemy inside their home, like betraying the dead. Lucas felt every ounce of it. He could feel the stairs on his back as he fitted a new strip of leather into the cracked valve. His hands shook. He nearly dropped a screw. The sanctuary air felt thick enough to choke on. He whispered to himself in German, "Keine Fehler, keine Fehler. No mistakes, no mistakes." He didn't know whether he feared punishment more from the Americans or from the men back in the POW camp who hated any sign of cooperation. But he knew this. One misstep here could destroy his chance to prove he was something other than a soldier in a uniform he never wanted to wear. As he worked, the silence in the room grew heavier. Not peaceful like a church should be, but loaded, brittle, ready to break. Fear had settled over Bellwood Baptist like dust, and yet underneath the fear, buried deep, something else began to stir. Something the people of Bellwood did not yet recognize. And something Lucas did not dare hope for. The seed of a possibility. A fragile, dangerous possibility that fear would soon collide with something stronger. But for now, fear ruled the sanctuary. Quiet, suffocating, mutual. Lucas eased the organ's side panel open with the tenderness of a surgeon exposing a damaged heart. Dust lifted into the warm air, catching the shafts of light that filtered through the stained glass windows. Behind him, dozens of eyes followed every motion. Eyes thick with doubt, guarded curiosity, and something else he couldn't name yet. He tried to steady his breathing. This was familiar work. This was the work he once believed he would do his whole life. But never like this. Never with an entire church watching. Never surrounded by the people his uniform had told him were enemies. He removed another layer of wood, then leaned in to inspect the rows of slender pipes, touching each one gently, brushing dust from their mouths. As he did, he whispered to himself in German, small technical phrases, the muttering of a craftsman lost in concentration. Several congregants stiffened. A few exchanged wary looks at the foreign words floating in their sanctuary. But Lucas wasn't praying to Germany, or Hitler, or any cause. He was speaking the language of work, the vocabulary his father had taught him in the quiet of their shop in Stuttgart, back when life was measured in octaves instead of orders. He tested the bellows, pressed on the air reservoir, and listened to the soft wheeze it made, weak but alive. "Gut, gut," he murmured. Someone closer to the front bristled. "What's he saying?" "Sounds like he's arguing with the organ," another muttered. The tension in the air thickened until a soft shuffle broke through. From the fourth pew, a small, bent-backed woman in a faded blue dress stood up and walked slowly toward the front. Her hair, silver as frost, was pinned neatly behind her ears. She moved without fear, without hesitation, carrying a small glass of water that reflected the morning light. Lucas froze as she approached. His shoulders stiffened as though anticipating a blow, but she offered him the glass, her voice warm and steady. "You look thirsty, son." The word son hit him harder than any slap. He blinked at her, unsure if he understood correctly. No one in America had called him anything but the German, the POW, the Kraut. But this frail woman stood inches from him, holding the glass like she might to her own grandchild. He swallowed, nodding once. "Danke. Thank you," he whispered. She smiled gently. "Ain't no trouble." The room shifted. Not dramatically, but subtly, like a window cracked open in a stale room. The veteran still eyed him warily, but the harshness had softened at the edges. A few women relaxed their hands on their Bibles. The MP behind him eased his stance by half an inch. Lucas took a careful sip and set the glass beside his toolbox. The cool water steadied him, though his hand still trembled slightly as he reached for the keyboard. He pressed a single key. The note that rose was faint, thin, but true. Not sharp, not flat. A fragile thread of sound that quivered in the rafters like a voice waking from sleep. A collective breath shivered through the sanctuary. Mrs. Parker pressed a hand to her chest. Roy Thompson's jaw clenched, but even he couldn't deny the purity of the sound. For 70 days their beloved organ had been silent, its absence a wound deeper than they admitted. Hearing that first note again felt like hearing a heartbeat after fearing it stopped. Lucas pressed another key, then another. Short, hesitant tones, each one floating through the church like shy visitors returning after a long exile. He adjusted a pipe, tightened a joint, wiped dust from a valve. The notes steadied, grew rounder. The tension in the sanctuary shifted yet again, this time into awe. A small boy with sandy hair and overalls slipped from his mother's grasp, curiosity triumphing over fear. He walked straight toward the organ, eyes wide. His mother gasped, reaching out, but it was too late. The child stood beside Lucas and pointed at the gleaming pipes. "Did you build this in Germany?" he asked. The question was so pure, so painfully innocent, that every adult in the room reacted at once. Some gasped, some whispered sharply. A few stiffened in alarm, but the boy didn't flinch. He simply stared up at Lucas with a child's honest fascination. Lucas looked down at him, stunned. The boy was close enough to touch. Not afraid, not hateful, just curious. He shook his head gently. "No," he said quietly. "But I build. One's like it. Long time ago." The boy nodded, completely satisfied. "It's real pretty. You're making it sound better." His mother hurried forward to retrieve him, her face red with embarrassment. But even she couldn't help glancing at Lucas, really looking at him for the first time. Not at a uniform, but at a man. Pastor Whitlow stepped toward the front, watching Lucas work with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. Weber," he said softly, "you handle that organ like you've known it all your life." Lucas paused. His fingers rested lightly on the keys. "It is. Like old friend," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight, because in 1944, while Europe lay shattered, its churches burned, its cities in ruins, this little American sanctuary stood untouched. Its colors still glowed through stained glass. Its wood still held warmth. Its pipes still waited for music. It was a contrast that every American in the room felt, even if they couldn't articulate it. Their church was safe because their sons fought far away. Their hymns still rose because the Battle of the Atlantic was being won. Their lives continued because the arsenal of democracy kept the nation strong. And here was a man from the losing side of that great war, thin, hungry, humbled, coaxing life back into the one thing in this church that mattered to all of them. A symbol of faith, a symbol of home, a symbol of everything they feared the war might one day steal. Lucas leaned over the keys again, adjusting a linkage. His movements became more confident. Each note he pressed rang clearer, fuller, reaching into corners of the sanctuary untouched in years. People leaned forward, forgetting their suspicion for a moment. For the first time, Bellwood Baptist saw something unexpected. A gentle skill in the hands they had once feared. A softness in the face they had only imagined as cruel. A hint, just a hint, that an enemy could also be a human being. The first kindness had been a glass of water. The second was simply allowing themselves to listen. And as Lucas continued his work, the church, its fears not gone but quieted, began to breathe again. The organ was waking. And so, in a small way neither side yet understood, was something larger. Something that would soon change all of them. The moment arrived quietly, almost timidly, as if the old organ needed to gather its courage before remembering what it once was. Lucas wiped his hands on the leg of his prison-issue trousers and drew a deep breath. Days of dust had settled onto his sleeves. His fingers, coated in a thin film of resin and leather dust, hovered above the keys as though unsure they were worthy of touching them. The sanctuary fell completely silent. Not the hush of polite expectation, but the deep, reverent stillness that only settles in a place where generations have prayed, married, mourned, and sung. Even the wind outside seemed to pause at the stained glass windows, listening. Lucas pressed a single bass pedal. This time, the sound didn't quiver. It didn't gasp like a dying breath. It rose, deep, resonant, full-bodied, as if the church itself had inhaled for the first time in months. The wooden pews vibrated with a warm hum. Dust trembled in the air. A low note rolled beneath everyone's feet, crawling up the walls, filling the rafters with something ancient and alive. Every head lifted, every eye widened, and Lucas felt it. Felt the organ respond to him the way the old German instruments once had. This wasn't a machine. It was a living thing, a memory carved in wood and breath and time. He pressed another key, then another. A chord flowed outward, soft at first, then gathering strength. The pipes, rows of them, polished and proud, began to speak again. Not as loudly as they could, not yet, but truly, unmistakably. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "It's working." But they hadn't heard anything yet. Lucas adjusted the stops with trembling fingers, pulling each knob with a soft click. He set the organ to full diapason, its grand signature voice, then placed both hands on the keyboard. The sanctuary seemed to lean forward as one. He began to play. The first measure floated gently into the air, a whisper of melody, tentative yet unmistakable. Amazing grace. A woman in the third pew pressed a hand to her mouth. The melody spread slowly across the sanctuary, reaching into corners untouched in years. It curled around the stained glass of St. Matthew, brushed past the hymnals that lined the backs of pews, drifted over the heads of veterans, widows, children, farmers, and the lone military policeman standing guard. Then came the bass. It entered like a heartbeat, deep, warm, carrying the weight of 7 decades of worship. As Lucas pulled the sub-bass stop and added the swell, the entire sanctuary shuddered, not with fear this time, but with awe. The organ did not sound repaired. It sounded reborn. People began to cry, not sobbing, not mournful, but the soft, uncontrollable tears of people hearing something they feared they had lost forever. The boy from earlier climbed back into his mother's lap, stunned. The MP lowered his gaze, blinking quickly. Even Roy Thompson, grief-worn, stubborn Roy, sat unmoving, lips parted, eyes shining with something he hadn't shown in public since his son's funeral. Lucas didn't see any of it. He couldn't lift his eyes, couldn't look at them, because the organ's voice, this resurrected voice, pulled him somewhere else entirely, back to Stuttgart, back to the small stone church near his childhood home, where he first watched his father tune pipes. Back to the mornings when sunlight spilled across the pews and dust danced through the air the exact same way it did here. Back to the last Sunday he spent with his father, before the war, before the bombs, before the American planes turned his neighborhood into rubble. His father had died under that rubble, killed by the same country whose people were now listening to him play Amazing Grace. The contradiction stabbed at him. His breath hitched, his hands shook, but he kept playing. He owed it to the instrument. He owed it to the music. He owed it to the memory of the man who taught him how to create beauty with his hands instead of destruction. The hymn rose higher, fuller. How sweet the sound. And as the notes filled the sanctuary, one of the elderly women, small, stooped, the same woman who had brought him water, stood up slowly. Her steps were unsteady, but her face was set with purpose. She approached Lucas as he played, her eyes glowing with something beyond emotion, something ancestral, sacred. When he reached the final measure of the verse, she placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. He stopped playing. The silence that dropped into the sanctuary felt heavier than any note. She squeezed his shoulder gently, voice breaking. "Thank you. Thank you, son." The word hit him like a hammer. Son. Not prisoner, not enemy, not German. Son. His breath faltered, his body stiffened, and then, all at once, everything he had held, inside for months, fear, hunger, loneliness, guilt, surged upward in a wave too powerful to contain. He broke. A soft sob escaped before he could swallow it down. He covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking. The congregation stared in stunned silence. Not at a German soldier, not at an enemy, but at a young man no older than their own sons. A young man grieving a father, grieving a home, grieving a world that no longer existed. Pastor Whitlow stepped forward, his voice low and gentle. "Son, it's all right." Lucas shook his head fiercely, words tumbling out through tears. "In Germany," he choked. "No music anymore. Only war." The impact hit the congregation like a physical blow. They knew Germany was bombed. They read the headlines, heard the Roosevelt broadcasts, saw photographs in Life magazine. But hearing it from the mouth of a German POW, from a boy with dust on his sleeves and pain in his voice, made it real in a way the news never could. Silence held the sanctuary for a long, trembling moment. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, people rose to their feet, not out of command or ritual or politeness, but out of something deeper, a recognition, a breaking of walls that propaganda, grief, and fear had spent years building. A veteran wiped his eyes. A mother whispered a prayer. A young man, barely 16, stared at Lucas with a dawning understanding that war had taken sons from both sides. Even Roy Thompson stood slowly, breathing unevenly, wrestling with the memory of his son and the revelation that the boy playing the organ was someone's son, too. Music had bridged a gulf no sermon ever could. Lucas lowered his hands from his face, blinking through tears. He looked at the congregation, really looked at them, for the first time. The suspicion in their eyes had softened, replaced with something fragile and powerful. Compassion, forgiveness, humanity. In that moment, without knowing it, Lucas Weber offered them a gift greater than the repaired organ. He reminded them who they were: a moral people, a merciful people, a people whose strength was not only in steel and factories and armies, but in kindness. The organ's last note faded into the rafters, but its echo lingered, settling deep into the hearts of everyone present. And the sanctuary, once filled with tension and distrust, now felt sanctified by something greater than music: grace, the kind that reaches across nations, across grief, across war, the kind that turns an enemy into a son. The organ's final notes still clung to the rafters when Lucas lowered his trembling hands. For a long moment, the sanctuary existed in a suspended silence, weightless, timeless, the kind of silence that follows revelation. It was as if the hymn had peeled back the layers of fear, anger, and grief that each person carried, leaving only the core of their shared humanity exposed. Lucas's palms were still damp with sweat when he whispered, almost to himself, "War made me a prisoner. Music makes me human again." The words drifted into the stillness, soft but unmistakably clear. They hit the congregation with a quiet force that no sermon had ever delivered. Several people closed their eyes, others simply stared at him, not in judgment now, but in recognition. It was Pastor Whitlow who finally stepped forward, his voice low, steady, and filled with wonder. "Son." That was more than music. Lucas didn't know what to say. He just nodded, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. He had tried to hold himself together, to remain the obedient prisoner, but the music had torn through every wall he'd built. It had carried him back to memories he had buried: his father's steady hands over the old organ in Stuttgart, his mother singing quietly as she ironed linens. The last Sunday he'd ever hear bells ring before the bombs changed everything. He never expected an American church to resurrect those memories. And yet, somehow, it had. A few pews back, Mrs. Parker, the grandmother who still carried her missing grandson's telegram, leaned forward, eyes brimming with tears. "He plays like someone who lost everything," she whispered. Her daughter nodded slowly. Maybe he did. The first to speak loudly enough for others to hear was Mr. Asa Ford, a veteran of North Africa who limped forward on a worn cane. His face was weathered, his skin browned by Texas sun, but his eyes held a weary wisdom. He stopped in front of Lucas, who instinctively tensed. Ford exhaled slowly. "If my boy was captured, I pray someone treated him the way we treated you today." The statement landed with the power of a confession. Ford's son, Isaac, was serving somewhere in France. Weeks earlier, their family had received a letter that said only "missing in action." presumed captured. No one spoke of it aloud, but everyone knew. Everyone imagined the worst. Yet here was a father admitting, without shame, that compassion given to an enemy was compassion he hoped someone would give to his own blood. Lucas blinked through the shock of it. Your son is a prisoner?" he asked slowly. "Maybe," Ford answered, voice cracking. "We don't know. But if he is, I hope God puts a man in front of him with half the mercy you showed today." Lucas shook his head as if unable to accept something so generous. I did nothing." "You brought music back," Ford replied. "That's more than most men can say during a war." Behind Ford, other veterans approached, not with hostility, but with cautious, deliberate steps. They stood in a semicircle, not surrounding Lucas but acknowledging him. One of them, a tall man named Frank Henderson who had fought at Kasserine Pass, spoke in a voice roughened by years of dust and diesel fumes. "Never thought I'd hear Amazing Grace played by a German," he said. "Never thought I'd feel anything other than anger for your kind." Lucas swallowed hard. "But today," Henderson paused, searching for the right words. "Today made me remember something my captain used to say. Don't let the war turn you into something your mama wouldn't recognize." A ripple of quiet agreement passed through the room. Lucas lowered his eyes. "In Germany," he said softly, "no music anymore, only war." The honesty of it, raw, unpolished, painful, struck the congregation deeply. They'd seen photos in newspapers, glimpses of cities reduced to ashes, children staring blankly into rubble. But hearing it from the mouth of a man whose hands had just restored beauty to their sanctuary created a contrast so sharp it bordered on unbearable. America in 1944 was strong, thriving even. Its factories hummed day and night. Ships rolled out of coastal yards faster than German U-boats could sink them. Planes filled the skies over Detroit, Los Angeles, and Seattle like steel flocks. Fields grew full and golden, feeding troops across the world. And here, in tiny Bellwood, Texas, the church organ sang again without fear of enemy bombs. The difference between the two worlds, between their safety and his destruction, had never felt clearer. Nor had the responsibility. A woman approached, Mrs. Thompson, Roy's wife. She held her husband's arm tightly, guiding him forward. Roy's eyes were red, but not from anger now. He studied Lucas for a long moment before speaking. "My son," he said hoarsely, "died fighting in Italy. I blamed every German I saw for it. Sometimes I still do." The admission weighed heavy in the room. Lucas bowed his head. "I am sorry," he whispered. Roy nodded, swallowing hard. "I know you didn't hold the rifle that killed him. I know that. But it's hard to separate faces in war." He paused, then added something no one expected. "But today, for the first time, I saw a German do something that reminded me what my boy believed this country stood for." Lucas looked up, startled. Roy continued, voice cracking. "He believed we were better, kinder, more decent than the people we fought, and watching what you did." He shook his head. It made me feel like maybe he wasn't wrong. The church fell silent again, but this silence was different, softer, warmer, grateful. Pastor Whitlow placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "It's not easy to be the enemy in another man's home," the pastor said. "But grace finds its way through unlikely doors." Lucas exhaled, feeling something inside him shift, something heavy and old loosening at last. He had lived so long under the weight of shame, shame of his uniform, shame of what his nation had become, shame of what soldiers like him had been forced to do. But in this sanctuary, For the first time since the war began, he felt dignity return, not from freedom, but from human recognition. He whispered, almost, afraid of the truth in the words, "Music heals faster than bombs destroy." Whitlow nodded. Grace always has. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse through the sanctuary, not with the hurried steps of people eager to escape discomfort, but with the measured quiet of people absorbing something profound. Conversations murmured like prayer. A few men shook Lucas's hand, awkwardly at first, then with firmness. A mother whispered, "Bless you," a teenager said. "That was real good, sir." An old farmer tipped his hat. To a prisoner, these gestures might have seemed small, but to Lucas, who had expected hatred, humiliation, they were overwhelming. The MP, who had watched everything with stoic professionalism, finally spoke. "We should get you back to camp, Weber," he said. But there was no hardness in the words now, only respect. Before Lucas could rise, the elderly woman who had offered the water earlier approached once more. Her hands were small and cool as she cupped his face gently, the way a mother steadies a crying child. "Son," she said softly, "God didn't send you here to suffer. He sent you here to remind us who we are." Lucas felt his chest tighten painfully. He didn't know how to answer. He wasn't sure he could, but she didn't wait for a response. She simply smiled, tenderly, sincerely, and turned back to rejoin her family. As he followed the MP toward the church doors, Lucas paused and looked back one last time at the organ. The pipes gleamed in the light, proud and upright, like a forest of silver reaching toward heaven. He whispered to himself, maybe I am still human." Outside, the Texas sun fell warmly on his face, and inside the sanctuary, the people of Bellwood felt something new settle into their hearts, a moral clarity, a remembrance of their country at its best. In 1944, America was winning the greatest war in human history. But on that quiet morning, in a little church far from any battlefield, they discovered something just as powerful. Victory was not just measured in factories, ships, or rifles. It was measured in the courage to show mercy, to see an enemy as a man, to choose grace over fear. The greatest generation had always known this. And now, for a moment, so did everyone in Bellwood. The truck rattled down the dirt road toward Camp Hearn as the afternoon sun burned low over the Texas plains. Lucas sat in the back, hands resting loosely on his knees, the dust rising behind him like a long, fading trail of memory. But his mind was still inside Bellwood Baptist Church, still hearing the swell of amazing grace, still feeling the trembling hand on his shoulder, still seeing faces softened by something he never believed he would witness in America. The MP driving the truck glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "You did good in there, Weber," he said simply. No lecture, no suspicion, just acknowledgement. Lucas didn't know how to respond, so he nodded once and kept quiet. The kindness unsettled him almost as much as it comforted him. The camp gates clanged shut behind the truck, echoing across the yard where prisoners were gathering for evening count. Voices drifted through the dry air. German, Bavarian dialect, Swabian, Prussian, all mixed with the occasional English curse picked up from guards. When the truck stopped, several POWs hurried over, curious about why Lucas, thin and quiet Lucas, had been taken out under escort. A corporal named Dieter was the first to speak. "Where did they take you?" he demanded. "Interrogation." "No," Lucas said. A few others leaned in. Their eyes were wary, braced for confirmation of the American brutality they still feared, despite months of evidence to the contrary. They make you clean latrines? Someone else asked. Make you work like slave? Did they mock you? Hit you? Lucas shook his head slowly. No, he said. They listened. The men stared at him. The yard fell unusually quiet. Listened, Dieter repeated. What do you mean, listened? I repaired their church organ, Lucas said, and they listened. One of the older POWs snorted. Americans don't let a kraut touch their holy things. But another man, Franz, who had spent weeks on labor detail working with American farmers, stepped closer. No, I believe him, he said softly. These Americans, they are different. Dieter scoffed again. Different how? Franz hesitated, then said the thing many of them had secretly begun to feel. Kinder. A ripple of unease passed through the group. The idea was dangerous, not because it might offend the Americans, but because it threatened the propaganda they had been raised on. For years, they'd been taught that Americans were selfish, cruel, morally empty, but nothing they had experienced here matched those stories. Lucas looked up slowly. They cried, he said. When the music played, they cried. More men gathered around, drawn by the strange tone in his voice, a softness they hadn't heard since before the war. And the pastor, Lucas added, struggling to find the right English words. He put his hand here. He placed his palm over his shoulder, and he said, It's all right, son. Several POWs inhaled sharply, not in anger, but in disbelief. A prisoner named Marcus, who had been a schoolteacher before being drafted, whispered, A pastor? Called you son? Lucas nodded. The silence that followed was different from the silence in the church. This one carried the weight of internal reckoning. The slow, painful shifting of beliefs held too long. Finally, Franz spoke again. Maybe, he said, maybe we are wrong about them. Dieter didn't argue this time. None of them did. That evening in the barracks, after roll call and the lukewarm supper of stew and bread, men gathered around Lucas's bunk. The lantern flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. Lucas sat cross-legged, still wearing the dust of the church floors. What did it sound like? One man asked. What did you play? Did they sing? Tell us everything. Lucas hesitated. The moment had been too sacred, too overwhelming to reduce to simple words. But he tried. It sounded like home, he said quietly. Not Germany, not America, just home. Even the hardened soldiers fell silent at that. He spoke of the tremble in the pipes, the gasp of the first note, the tears that fell in the pews. He spoke of the bass roll vibrating through the floorboards, of the boy who had asked him if he built the organ, of the veteran whose voice broke as he wished mercy for his own missing son. He did not speak of his own tears, but he didn't have to. They could hear it in the way his voice wavered. When he finished, one of the younger POWs said what many of them were thinking. I think, he whispered, I think I would like to see such a church. Another added, I would like to hear such kindness. Dieter, who had been silent for a long time, finally spoke. War teaches us to hate, he said, but today, maybe we learned something else. Weeks passed. Word spread through the camp about the church, the organ, the hymn. Even guards approached Lucas differently now, less suspicion, more quiet respect. A few asked him questions about Germany, about music, about what organs were like in European cathedrals. And among the prisoners, something shifted, something subtle but unmistakable. The hardliners in the barracks, the ones who clung to ideology like a raft in a storm, found fewer men willing to listen. The stories of cruelty they repeated from memory sounded stale, dead, irrelevant. Instead, new stories began to travel between bunks. They gave me extra bread when I was sick. My boss on the farm taught me how to mend fences. The nurse in the infirmary tucked a blanket around me. The cook saved me the end slice of the cornbread. Lucas's story fit into this quiet revolution of thought, becoming a symbol of something none of them had expected: mercy. And mercy, once witnessed, is impossible to forget. History would later confirm what these men began to feel in their bones. After the war, thousands of German POWs returned to America, not as prisoners but as immigrants. Some became engineers, farmers, doctors, mechanics. Others became organ builders like Lucas. Many wrote in letters and memoirs the same astonishing truth: the Americans treated us better than our own army did. Some even wrote something more shocking: America taught me how to be human again. One evening, Franz asked Lucas quietly, "Do you think you will go back to Germany after the war?" Lucas stared at the barrack wall for a long time before answering. "Germany is not the place I remember," said. "But America," he swallowed. "America feels like a place where a man could start again." The others nodded slowly, because deep down, each of them knew the same thing. If kindness was a weapon, America wielded it better than any nation in history. And they were living proof. In the dim light of the barrack's lantern, Lucas closed his eyes and heard the memory of the organ swell once more. The bass trembling in his chest, the soft sobs of the congregation, the whispered thank you that broke him open. He smiled faintly. "No," he whispered to himself. "They didn't shame me." He opened his eyes, filled with a quiet reverence. They listened. The decades that followed smoothed the rough edges of memory, the way time softens the corners of an old photograph. The war ended, the camps were emptied, the trucks stopped carrying German prisoners across Texas roads. But in Bellwood Baptist Church, one quiet piece of history remained, hidden in plain sight among the pews, the stained glass, and the hymnal racks: the organ. It still stood at the front of the sanctuary, tall and dignified, its pipes polished every spring by whichever volunteer claimed the job that year. The wood darkened with age but never lost its warmth, and the voice of the instrument, once silenced by time, continued to rise every Sunday morning. In 1974, during a renovation, the church removed the rear panel of the organ to inspect its inner structure. What they found stopped the committee in stunned silence. There, tucked neatly inside, attached with 2 rusted screws, was an old strip of leather, carefully stitched by hand. Next to it lay a set of initials burned into the wood: L.W. One of the elders whispered, "That must have been from the POW, the young one." The memory had become a story, the story had become a legend, and now the legend had become proof. When the organ was rededicated later that year, the church added a small brass plaque along the side panel. It read, in simple engraving, "Repaired in 1944 by a German prisoner of war. No name, no rank, no country. Just the truth." The congregation insisted on it, not as a political statement, not as a symbol of victory, but as a gentle reminder of the morning when fear gave way to mercy. Children who grew up in Bellwood during the 1950s and 60s learned the story early, usually from grandparents who sat in the same pews they had as young adults. One of those grandchildren, now an old man himself, would later tell his granddaughter, "My grandfather always said, 'We defeated the Nazis without losing our humanity. That's what made America different.'" She asked him once if he ever met the German POW. "No," he said, smiling softly, "but I heard him play, and that was enough." Through generations, the tale became part of Bellwood's own history, not officially recorded, not taught in schools, but passed hand to hand, like an heirloom of the heart. Most towns bragged about founders, railroads, or battles. Bellwood bragged that a German prisoner once brought their church back to life. Meanwhile, across the ocean, another story continued to grow. Lucas Weber returned to Germany after the war, thinner, quieter, but carrying something he had not possessed when he was captured, the belief that people, even enemies, were capable of grace. He rebuilt his life slowly, working again on organs in the ruins of Stuttgart, helping restore churches gutted by bombings. He never forgot the morning in Texas. He never forgot the water glass, the tears, the touch on his shoulder, the whispered, "Thank you, son." He never forgot the feeling of being seen as a human being in a country that had every reason not to. And when he had children of his own, he told them the story, not about the war, not about captivity, but about kindness. "America saved me," he told them in his accented English, a language he continued practicing long after returning home. "Not just my life, my soul." His children grew up hearing those words. They grew up imagining their father, young and scared, sitting behind a church organ in a land he barely understood, healing a congregation that feared him. So when the Berlin Wall fell and travel became easier, the Weber family made a decision. They would go to Texas. They would see the place that changed their father's life. It was a warm spring morning in 1991 when the Webers, Lucas's daughter, her husband, and their 2 teens pulled up to the white church with the old steeple and the neat rows of windows. Birds perched along power lines. The sun glowed on the red earth just as it had nearly 50 years earlier. Inside, the church was empty except for an elderly janitor sweeping near the altar. He looked up as the family entered, surprised but friendly. "Y'all visiting?" he asked. The daughter stepped forward. "My father repaired your organ during the war." The broom slipped from the janitor's hands. His family." She nodded. He stared at them for a long, reverent moment before motioning them forward. "Come see something," he said. He led them to the side of the organ and pointed to the brass plaque. Tears filled the woman's eyes as she read the words her father never lived to see. She touched the metal with her fingertips, tracing the letters as if tracing his memory. Then she stepped to the bench. "May I?" she whispered. "Of course," the janitor said. She sat, lifted her hands, and gently pressed a few keys. The notes were warm, full, alive. The same notes her father had restored. The same instrument that had witnessed his tears, his confession, his rebirth. Her voice cracked as she whispered, barely audible, "Thank you, America. You saved him." Her children stood silently watching her, understanding now why their grandfather always spoke of a faraway land with such reverence. The legacy of that moment, of that morning in 1944, lived not in military records or official archives, but in quiet places, in the soft vibration of organ pipes, in the memories passed from parent to child, in the lasting dignity of a small Texas church, in the gratitude of a family who crossed an ocean to pay their respects, and in the hearts of Americans who remembered what their ancestors once knew. That victory meant little if it cost their humanity. The story of the German POW who repaired the organ was never written into textbooks. It never made national news. It didn't change the outcome of the war, but it changed something far more enduring. The people who lived it, the families who remembered it, and everyone, American and German, who came after. For in that sanctuary, on a dusty morning in 1944, they had glimpsed the truest strength a nation can possess: mercy.